Good afternoon. Welcome to another D2 webinar. A little bit of a different format today. We wanted to try something out, so I actually have Daryl with me. Hey, Daryl.
How you doing, sir?
Not too bad.
Good, good, good.
So today, I guess we're tackling in camera, the whole concept of in camera, the whole sort of focus around it. And I've got new technology causing problems. There we go. So, what is an in camera board meeting?
Interesting question, Jeremy. You know, it's probably the most misunderstood term in all of the governance processes. I find that in-camera meetings tell the story of just how good an organization's governance practices are. And if they're not having regular in-camera meetings, then it raises a big red flag for me. I'll say that up front. But in-camera comes from the Latin term in chambers. Which means that from a legal perspective, it's in secret. In other words, that the only people that would attend would be the board itself, and the board would be there to discuss more sensitive issues that they wouldn't feel comfortable discussing with, say, management and others that may be around. So that's really the in-camera purpose. I think it needs to be done on a regular basis. If it's only done seldom, then it can raise a red flag. But if it's done on a regular basis, then people that are around the board, whether it's the board of directors themselves, whether it's management, staff, any others that participate in the board meeting, will feel more comfortable that these in-camera discussions. But it is a good governance practice and should be done.
So what you're saying is it's actually an official thing. It's a real term.
Absolutely.
I mean, because I know there's guys like me we've served on a board, but it's not something we hear about all the time.
You know, something like that, you're absolutely right, Jeremy. And in fact, the majority of boards don't know much about an in-camera. And as I said a little earlier, it's probably the most misunderstood governance practice, to be quite honest with you. And boards either don't do it at all, or if they do, it's very, very seldom and not very well structured.
So now that we know that it's this whole private thing, why would I do it? What's the whole reason to?
Well, there are a number of areas that you need to understand. The board needs to understand, and sometimes they're not comfortable speaking about them or discussing them when others are around, and they need to break off. Some of them are regular events that they need to discuss, and some of them could just happen that shouldn't have happened, but needs to have a discussion, and again, with just the board involved. And when you have those types of situations, by not having a discussion, leaves the board vulnerable.
Right. Okay. So, just walk us through a little bit about when it's appropriate, what the process is, who should be involved, that kind of thing.
Okay. What I'm going to talk about specifically is a little bit more on why the board in-camera meeting is important, mm-hmm. and who's responsible for that. And then I'm going to move into who gets invited to these. Who, there's always going to be the board members there, but are there always invitees? And what do they discuss? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the in-camera around the audit committee and around the external audit process. Listen, as I said, many boards don't do an in-camera, and even less even think about it when it's talking about the external audit.
I'm assuming you can get into trouble if you're not doing this stuff.
Listen, you can, and I'm going to talk a little bit, an example of that at the very end of an organization that got in serious trouble. But it's important that the boards look at this as a good governance practice and practice that on a frequent basis.
Very good.
So let's get right into it.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about why it is important. And the first thing I want to make, and I think it's the point I want to make, and I think it's the obvious. It's a good governance practice. You need to have that opportunity to speak candidly, just to board, on certain items that are more sensitive in nature. So that needs to happen. But I also think that not just it being a good governance practice, but it is really the responsibility of the board. Good governance is a board responsibility anyway. And part of that good governance responsibility is ensuring that the whole in-camera process is outlined in detail in a policy.
I wonder where they can get that.
Yes, D2. We have a generic policy that talks about that. And in the policy, the in-camera process should be should be outlined on how it's done, who manages it, when it's done, the frequency, all the pieces that the board needs as a guide, and it should be in the policy. And the policy that usually is attributed to this is the policy around effective board meetings. So in the effective board meetings policy, you'll have that particular piece, and the board would be responsible for that. The board is responsible for good governance. And I mentioned earlier, as we started this webinar today, that if the in-camera sessions are not happening in a particular board, it raises a red flag for me. I start to wonder what other governance practices aren't in place, and what happens to the items that are normally discussed in an in-camera session, which I'll talk about as well.
Is this one of the, would you consider this like a top 10 thing to have in your process?
In fact, I would call that a top 5. I think it's really, really important that you have that opportunity, particularly with the external auditor, because the external auditor, and I'll talk about that a little later as well, they are doing the audit of your financial situation. They are providing you with the confirmation of the integrity and the reliability of your audit of your financial information and financial statements. And if they can't do that, then you won't get a clean audit, and that's going to cause some red flags with your key stakeholders.
All right.
So let's get right into who attends these meetings and what is generally discussed.
So is it everyone on board, or what?
Well, everybody on board but management.
But management.
and I'm not degrading management here, but the board governs the organization. They provide governance oversight, so they got to use all the tools to their disposal to provide that governance oversight as effectively as possible. And one of those tools is the in-camera. So they will do that without management, so they can have a very candid and very direct discussion around particular issues. Now, they may invite guests to the in-camera, and generally speaking, there's only 3 guests that I've ever seen that were invited to an in-camera. One was the external auditors, because there was a problem in an issue that they had to deal with, and that needed to be done in camera. I've also seen where the legal counsel of the organization has been invited, and that has to do with whether there is a termination of say, the executive director or CEO, or whether there was a fraud that happened, or any litigation that's happening. They would bring in the their external legal counsel to provide some critical information to them. And finally, the regulator. Sometimes the regulator is not comfortable with what's going on with the organization, and they would ask for an in-camera with the board to have that discussion without management. So those are typically the guests that would be involved. And when the meeting happens, you need to realize that the meeting structure is similar to a board meeting structure. And what I mean by that is that you still follow Robert's Rules of Order in conducting a meeting. And the board chair is the facilitator. They conduct the meeting, and they will have the agenda items already pre-drafted and passed out only at the meeting. And those agenda items either came from previous board meetings, or somebody just gave the board chair a call, so we need to discuss this.
For those who aren't familiar with Robert's Rules of Order,
Robert's Rules of Order is one of the guides that has been written to provide support to boards in how they conduct their board meetings, from calling the meeting to order, all the motions that are done, even the adjournment process, and making sure everybody has an opportunity to speak on a particular item. All of those pieces of a meeting conduct is outlined in Robert's Rules of Order, and it's important that a board have one of those, had that guide in place, or Herb Perry's Call to Order, which is another document that can be used. And both of those booklets, it's very clear, very concise, and very easy to follow. And whichever you use, the board needs to have that at the forefront when they're conducting meetings.
Now, this, along with the in-camera stuff, is stuff that we cover at D2, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Those who are wondering whether they're following one types of rules versus the others, don't worry about it. The stuff at D2 that you'll find there is written for both. So Daryl, luckily, he's an expert on both, so he's been able to take that into account.
I've been involved in so many board meetings through my journey, and many in-camera meetings. Not as many as you would think. In fact, many of the boards I was on did not have an in-camera meeting. And I can remember in many of the I do lots of presentations on good governance, and some of the presentations I was doing with boards on effective board meetings, I talked about the in-camera meeting. And interestingly, I got a lot of questions about that. And the reason I got a lot of questions is because it was not practiced in their organizations. And so they didn't know what it was. In fact, one board said to me, board member said, "Are these meetings filmed? Are they recorded?" Because of the word in camera, obviously. And the answer to that is no, they're not, for sure. And another board member asked me, why do we even need secret meetings? Because I said that the legal term was in secret. And I said, well, the term in secret means that it's only the board. It doesn't have management. So the board members are not in secret. They're there together. And it's just an opportunity for them to talk candidly and in a more comfortable setting, especially if the discussion is about something that management was involved in or the employees were involved in.
Right, like you alluded to earlier, was it could be, a sensitive subject. Maybe you're dealing with, what are you doing with the chair of the organization? What are some of those kind of key places where they really come into play?
That's a great segue into what is discussed at these meetings, and there are a number of sensitive issues as you used that term, Jeremy. In most of these situations, it is sensitive, and the board needs to grapple with it, and they need to grapple with it without management being around, and to be able to decide what needs to be done. And some of the items could be things like that are regular occurrences. And that's why, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of regular occurrences. And so when a board doesn't have that discussion in camera, I wonder what is their governance process around it. So here's a couple of examples that I'm talking about. One is the annual performance review of the chief executive officer or executive director. So that's done on an annualized basis and sometimes semi-annually. And the board needs to discuss the performance process. And what if there's a particular performance issue that they need to talk about? How do they talk about that? Well, the only way to talk about it is in camera. You're not going to bring the CEO in on an initial discussion, because that is only done with the board chair once the board has an opportunity to discuss it. So there's two examples right there on the necessity for an in-camera.
So how are some boards doing that wrong?
Well, I would suggest to you that in many of my presentations to boards is that there is not a formal performance review process for CEOs. So there's not even an expectation set. They basically have looked at, that the day in and day out activity. If everything's going fine, then that's all that's needed. But best practice organizations and those that are very successful, they set expectations that include the strategic priorities, but it also includes day-to-day operations for the CEO or executive director. They do that in advance, and they review that twice a year, and with a 6-month review and then a final review, and that is how the compensation is set for the CEO, quite frankly.
So if I'm having what really should be an in-camera conversation with my board, and we didn't do it that way, it's all recorded and out in the open. I've been on small boards before where they have treated it like their own small, almost confessional.
Yeah.
Where they just they talk about whoever the CEO is or whatever,
and with the CEO there?
May not be there, but it's certainly in the minutes.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. You don't, when you're doing an in-camera discussion, you need to realize that they are sensitive, as we talked about,
right.
and whether you take notes or don't take notes is entirely up to the organization. Some organizations that do have in camera, and they're few and far between, do take notes, and some don't. But if you are taking notes, they need to be filed under lock and key, and only privy to the board chair and the corporate secretary on behalf of the board, and only for a reminder review process
Right.
because they do not enter the minutes. If you do not make a motion to do something in the in-camera, any particular motions need to come out of the in-camera and be done so at the regular board meeting. Okay, and very seldom are there any motions that are done. There just may be agreements that we're going to go down this road or that road, and that's fine. But if there is a motion required, it needs to come out. And that's why it's important to have an in-camera meeting at the start of every board meeting. And people may say, well, geez, why would you need to do it that often? Well, at least it's there, and you may not have anything to discuss, but everybody knows that the in-camera is a part of the meeting process. It's at the start of the meeting, before the meeting's called to order, and it's just with the board. And if anything needs to come out into the meeting, it can be done so at that meeting, which is an amendment to the agenda, as opposed to waiting to the next following month or quarter for the meeting. It's just more convenient and more effective to do it that way. And if when you do that, everybody knows it's being done. Everybody knows that they're not going to feel that why is this secret meeting going on, because they're going to know it's part of the regular process.
I think that's a key thing right there, part of the regular process. Yeah. And I think it's also key to realize that it's not necessarily its own meeting either. It's part.
Yes, it is.
You don't have to all get back together again.
Yeah, you're in the same room.
Right.
And so the in-camera is called to order by the board chair. And he or she calls it to order. They discuss the items and they adjourn. And then they bring management into the meeting and they start the regular meeting.
Proceed as normal.
Exactly. And it continues that to down.
It must save some headaches with trying to get some sensitive subjects taken care of.
It does. I mean, you know, when you're talking about the performance expectations and the performance review, for example, of the CEO, that's generally done by the executive committee of the board. Right. And they are just bringing their review to the rest of the board, and they do that in camera. And they discuss, here's what's good, here's what's not good, here's what our recommendations are, so everybody's on the same page. And it's the executive through the board chair that will eventually meet with the CEO to provide the review to the CEO in a new compensation, if there is any. There are other items that you would discuss in camera. It's not just about the CEO's performance. There could be a fraudulent activity that is ongoing, that's happening right now, that came to light, and you're going to discuss that. And there may be some termination as a result of it, and you may invite your legal counsel for that. Right. There could be other litigation matters. Somebody could be suing the organization for whatever reason, and you may want your legal counsel there as you're having that discussion. There could be an issue between a board member and the CEO that are not getting along, and something has happened. So both that board member and the CEO would not be invited to that particular meeting. So everybody could speak independently. There could be an issue where the external auditors, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, have an issue with what happened in the external audit that need to talk to the board, not just the finance committee, and that could happen. So there's a number of sensitive subjects that could result in a board in-camera discussion, and having that set in place all the time will enable those kinds of discussions happening without the fear of what's being discussed, because we've never had a board in camera before, and that's what has to happen. And it's just a good practice and a best practice for boards to do so.
Before we get into the next bit, I just want to mention really quickly, if you have any questions for Daryl on this topic, or maybe this one goes in really well with the last topic we had, which was being your emergency preparedness of your board to deal with things that come up. Any questions, drop them down in the chat in Facebook, drop them in a comment on the YouTube channel, or drop them in an email to us. Or go through the website d2sup.com.
Perfect. And let's talk about a little bit more on the external auditor.
Yes.
And where an external auditor, may have some issues. When the external auditor is involved and they come in to do that audit for the organization, it's either, in some cases I've seen the board manages that process themselves. In other cases I've seen it the finance committee. Regardless, when the external auditors are there, they will go over the very first meeting. the audit scope. And the audit scope meaning primarily is what areas they're going to test and what's their financial threshold. They put a number, a threshold of what they'll test above that number. And they'll talk about how long they're going to be there and that they'll be working, they're going to not try to disrupt the organization. And obviously they'll talk about their fees. So in that audit scope meeting, it's important that the board or finance committee, who's ever involved, has an in-camera with the external auditor. And I'm going to say that in-camera with the external auditor is probably more important than the external, than the in-camera with the board on a monthly basis. And the reason for that is the financial statements need to be accurate. The key stakeholders, the readers of the statements, they want to make sure that they can trust the reliability and accuracy and integrity of the financial statements. Because if they can't, and the auditor can't say they're reliable, then they will make that notation right on the front of the financial statements, which is going to cause some reputational damage to the organization. So the board and or finance committee need to work very closely with the external auditor. So they will ask some questions to the external auditor. They may want the threshold to be lowered in certain areas. They may want it to be lowered in, say, expense accounts of management. Okay, they may want it to be lowered in such areas as expenditures, particularly expenditures that are already over budget. And if they're over budget, they may want confirmation the reason they're over budget by having a little bit of a deeper check than just what the CEO or executive director has told them throughout the year. So those kinds of things. And it's also important to keep the external auditor up to date on any significant situations that could affect the integrity or reliability of the financial statement. So for example, somebody new in the financial side of the organization may not have the experience, so you may want to watch that a little bit closer. Another area could be that the fraud that I mentioned earlier that had happened throughout the year, you need to bring the external auditor up to date on that fraud so they can check to see, are the internal controls that were since implemented, are they effective? Are they working? And to provide that reassurance to the board and any litigation that's happening. So they are aware of the litigation so they can manage that and they may want to do some testing, deeper testing in that particular area. And finally, if there's a toxic environment between the staff and the CEO and management, to advise them of that because they need to be aware that what's happening and maybe controls aren't as diligent as they should be, or information isn't coming forth as it should be. So those are the kinds of things that the board or finance committee would bring to the external auditor. So then the external auditor goes out and does their audit. And then they come back with the final results.
Is it safe to say there can be quite a bit of difference between having the auditor in a regular old general meeting versus the in-camera? For the freedom that people have to actually disclose?
All those items I just mentioned probably wouldn't be disclosed.
Right.
And if the auditor is caught blindsided by any of those items, it's not going to be good because then they may want to increase their testing. They may be challenging the reliability and the integrity of the financial statements to such a level that they can't sign off on the financials. And so it's really important you have that relationship. And when they come back with the final results, you go in camera again after they present the final results. Right. And here's where everything is, and you have a chance to ask questions. Then they go in camera and they'll answer those initial concerns you have. And if there's any situations that that the board needs to be aware of, they're going to let them know and with some recommendations. And it gives that board the reassurance and moving forward.
Okay. All important information for sure.
Listen. It is extremely important, and you have so many people relying on your financial statements. Obviously, the internal stakeholders, who I call the staff and board. They're there every day. They're relying on the statements, and they want to make sure that the organization is sound financially and sustainable. But more importantly, it's it's the users of the services that the organization provides. Because if that organization has problems and it cannot continue, because let's say the donors are concerned about their financial assistance, they may withdraw part or all of their financial donorship, and then you're in a situation where you may not be financially stable and being able to provide all of the service, and all of a sudden you're cutting back services just to survive. You don't want to be in that situation. The reputation damage that can cause is significant. So it is extremely important that when you're talking financials, that you have this in-camera process. Now, I will give you an example that I lived, and I've been on many boards, and the majority of boards that I've been on did not have an in-camera. I'll say that up front. Best practice boards that I was on did, and they did it on a regular basis. And you know, and when I hear board members saying to me when I'm facilitating sessions on effective board meetings, they never had it, or they don't know anything about it, or they're concerned, it prompted me to provide this type of webinar, because if you're not aware of it, you need to be as a board member. It's your responsibility. And I'll give you an example of what happened. This is very serious. I was a regulator during this particular time, and this particular board had the external auditors in play. They were doing their audit, and they were not getting information that they needed. Now, this was a very reputable brand name external auditing firm, and they were trying to get an in-camera meeting with the board, and it was thwarted every time they tried to do it. The CEO would not allow them to talk to the board, and was not providing the financial information that they needed. It got so bad that halfway through the audit, the external auditors quit. They resigned right there. Now, when an external auditor resigns on doing the audit, that is the biggest red flag for a regulator, and quite frankly for any stakeholder. Why did that happen? It should never happen unless there was something that was very significant that they did not feel comfortable that they could provide the external auditor to the audit to the level they needed. So we ended up going in as a regulator, taking control of the situation, hiring another external auditing firm that specializes in this type of audit, and brought them in from another province, and they did the audit. And subsequently, and we made sure, by the way, that they had all the information at their disposal. And anytime they didn't, they were to respond directly to us, because we were the ones that took control of the situation, and we had hired them on our behalf. When they finalized the audit, they contacted us, and they said, you need to place this organization under your control immediately because of the significant deficiencies in the quality of their processes. And we did, and there were substantial financial losses, substantial reputational risks to that organization. But it could have been averted if the external audit had been allowed to do what they needed to do. And the external audit that was previous to this brand name was a local auditing firm, and they certainly did not do what they needed to do, and they were taken to task legally for their inaction during their audit process. So it can be very, very, very detrimental to the organization, and it's important that the board take responsibility for their in-camera, particularly with the external auditor.
Quite the story.
Quite the story. It's something I don't want to live again,
No.
Quite frankly. And but you know, these situations can happen.
Right.
And you know, I've said this on previous webinars. The old adage that it won't happen here, you can't live by that anymore, because it will. It's just a matter of time. Particularly if you do not have good governance practices. And this practice of in-camera meetings is one of the better ones that you need to get aligned to as quickly as possible.
Ready for a couple questions?
I am.
All right. First question we're being asked is, how do I introduce this to our board? We've never done it.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting is doing that. Generally speaking, boards do not know about internal audits, about the internal in-camera meetings. You just don't understand what an in-camera meeting is and why it's important. So you got to use the examples of what would be covered and maybe some of those areas that are not being done now, should to be done, will be covered, and maybe they're going to be done. But you would put in in play that here are some of the items that we need to discuss. You know, how do we deal with the performance review of the CEO? How do we deal with the performance issue that we may have with the CEO? What if there's an issue with the external auditor? How do we deal with that? How do we convey to the external auditor of things that they should be checking? So all of these things you should list down as part of, these are the things that should be in an in-camera meeting, and go at it from that perspective. And that way you have a structure in place of what would be part of the in-camera, as opposed to coming in and say, we just have to have an in-camera meeting because it's a good governance practice.
Right.
Well, why is it a good governance practice? Here's the reasons. Do that up front.
Right. So if I'm not the board chair and I want to introduce, I should probably go to my chair and have them.
Yeah,
introduce it.
that's a good point, Jeremy. You would go to the board chair and you would say to the board chair that this is something that, instead of putting the board chair on notice, say this is something that we should discuss at our board meeting.
Or point them to this webinar.
Well, that too. And so when they're at the board meeting, that is an agenda item, and so they can discuss what are some of the things that should be on. So everybody's there. It's not just the board chair making that decision. It's the entire board having that discussion.
Mm. Another question we got was, so we do minutes for everything. And if I'm not supposed to put them in the minutes, how do I record this? And what does lock and key mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. I use the term keeping notes as opposed to keeping minutes.
Right.
For the in-camera. Because you're not taking minutes for an in-camera meeting, even though it's structured the same. That's the only process that I would suggest you don't need to do unless you're adamant to do it. Obviously, it's a board decision, and I've seen boards do, and they take the notes. It's not, you know, a motion made or you know, this was a decision or what have you, because that's not done. But you're taking notes, and the notes can be signed off by the board chair and the corporate secretary at the end, and they're filed under lock and key. And what I mean by that is they are filed separately away from the general board minutes, because the board meeting minutes are available to anybody, and they don't have to be under lock and key. They just need to be kept in chronological order and signed by both the board chair and the corporate secretary, that they have been approved by the board. The notes of the in camera are separate, and they're in another filing cabinet, say, that's under lock and key, and who holds that lock or holds those keys are the board chair and the corporate secretary, and that way they can be provided to the board if they need to do a review. And keep in mind, the CEO or executive director has no control
access,
over that area.
Very good. All right, so my last question is, if I don't have any of this in my process, and I don't really have much of a board process other than we go in, we keep minutes, we talk about whatever I had on the list from last time, what do we have on offer at D2 that could help folks kind of get this all in place?
Well, you know something, if you need to start from scratch with your governance process, my recommendation is that you contact D2. You need to put in a process of good governance for the board, and that starts with having the applicable governing policies. You need to have the right governing policies in place that are pertinent for your organization. We have identified 18 that we consider to be the key governing policies for any organization, and those what we've done with those policies is we've also created guides and the guidebooks, and we've created a video and some generic forms and that they can use as well. That way you now know what your governance structure is. You can't do that all in one setting, obviously, but starting with what are the governing policies we need, and then you move upwards and forward from that.
And one of those 18 that Daryl mentioned, we actually have on the site right now for free, depending on when you're watching this. If you're watching it in early 2024, it's still there. It's still free, so you can get just a little bit of a taste of the different policies and different processes that Daryl's been able to put together for us here at D2. So
that
thanks.
one is, and we put that free, Jeremy, as you know, because it's probably the most important governing policy, or one of the more important ones, because it's an action that happens every month minimum, and that is conducting effective board meetings.
That's one of the fun things we have at D2, always trying to argue which one's the most important.
Yes, yes,
So
exactly.
thanks again, Daryl.
My pleasure.
I know we have another one coming up in a couple of weeks. The topic is, as always, still being debated, unless you've hit on one already.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about board orientation.
Ah,
And the reason I want to talk about board orientation, we're getting that time of year where boards are going to be having their annual meetings and there'll be new directors coming on board. So how do you get your board member ready for day one?
there you
We're
go.
going to talk about that.
That's going to be an interesting one. And if you have an idea or a question or whatever you want to know about how to run your board more effectively, to govern more effectively, just check us out at d2sup.com. Send us a message, and we could be doing one of these based on your suggestions. Who knows? So until then, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.